some people think, hey, you have to be born with this, a special thing that makes you innovative or creative or whatever. But what the scientists have said, no, the truth really is that our brains are uniquely wired to be creative.
Welcome to the Optimalist podcast, where we've set out to examine the higher order capabilities we need to build an optimal future with AI. I'm Sarah, your host through this exploration of elements of human flourishing. So let's figure out together how we can cultivate them. When today's guest reached out to me about possibly being on the show, he said this: "The best piece of advice that I've shared with my children is that the line between points A and B is never a straight one. Sometimes it feels like we're going in the opposite direction. This is why I studied the creative process. Creativity is all about failures, iterations, and discovery. Many think that creativity is something you have to be born with, but the truth is we are all wired to create. And I believe creativity is just another way to describe what people do when they thrive. When we unlock it, it opens our minds to bridge between ways of thinking that can transform us. And I'd love to share this with your audience, insights from scientists and creatives that helped me develop a process. Are you in?" So today I welcome Rich Kirkpatrick, a musician and author of the book Mind Blown: Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic. And until a few weeks ago, I didn't know that Rich existed in the world. But I am so glad that he found me, because this conversation is unique, exploratory, and helpful in making the thinking about creativity quite accessible. So I'll just repeat what Rich said here. Are you in? Welcome to the Optimalist.
I used to work in really strict church environments as a creative person, as a musician, as a person who put productions together. And so I said, I was one of only, of course, when you're a creative person, you're probably by yourself anyway. If you're in a corporate environment, you're, the one graphic designer in the office or the one, whatever. And so that experience over time led me to have to explain the kinds of things that I needed in order to do my job, in order to recruit musicians to be a part of whatever it was I was doing, or to record music and all those kinds of things. And so over time, I ended up, teaching workshops to church musicians and how to get through and how to explain your role. Because it's not like theater where you have an exact list of roles of what you do. And so that was an important thing. It was just kind of like deconstruct that a little bit. As time grew on, I had some folks come up on the workshops I would teach, and they'd say, "Hey, Rich, explain your creative process to me." And suddenly I went blank because I didn't really look at it that way. And that set me off.
That's like thinking formally about it, right?
Yeah.
In a way that you wouldn't have thought. Yeah.
So anyways,
that
what that did was get me to ask and be curious about what is this creative process? What do I do? To have the right to explain it to other people. It's one thing to say, hey, if you want to find musicians, here's ways to find them and that kind of practical stuff. But how do we create and how do we keep that going? So that set me off on lots of curious conversations when I used to drive Lyft. And on the way to the LAX airport, I met all sorts of people, as you would, because it's a terrible ride, folks. If you're not in Los Angeles, you live there for 15 years.
The worst thing.
Isn't it that worst little drive? It's not like you can get to the airport, like you can see it, but then there's that, 20 minutes or.
You know what it is? People always complain. And I say this when people are flying in here into LA and they're like, and they've never been to LA, and they'll be like, I'm nervous about going to the airport. And I'm like, meanwhile, I'm from New York and we're used to all those airports. I'm like, it's really not bad. What's bad is the getting to and from and getting the ride share. I find it better than New York airports as far as if I'm going to go to the airport and fly out of it, but it's coming back and then having to get into a rideshare experience. That is a wild time. I'm telling you.
Well, see, like now I'm in Oakland, I just take the BART train and that helps. So anyway, so I was stuck with people and I would try it out. And this guy was a filmmaker and this guy was she was a cook or chef, and wonderful conversations because I love just to talk to people. And so I tried out this idea that I came up with this for creative process, these three zones or three steps. And they all loved the idea. My barber loved it. And, being around people in Los Angeles and when I lived in Long Beach, and just the work that I do, it just came upon me because the center of my work is I'm into developing people. I just think that's the one thing that's kind of centered everything that I do. I'm married to an educator, and so we all have this same altruism. We want to see people become more of themselves, and so that really, to me, you intersect that with creativity. I started blogging in early 2000s, and I would write about these three zones, like your creativity and how that affects how you lead people, or your spirituality, or your growth. And so creativity for me became what I kind of see it now as just another way to describe what people do when they thrive. But that's kind of led me to this point of how do this desire to see others thrive and creativity, when they kind of hit each other. And it was a wonderful realization.
I like that. A couple things you just said about creativity are not ways that I have heard before. I would have thought, like, specifically creativity is what people do when they thrive, because that goes with, like, I'm sure I know that I'm not the only one, but I've always had this really deep core belief that creativity is really like one of the human qualities, right? It's what makes us, we all have the ability to, like almost everything you do as you're walking about your day, no matter who you are, is in its nature creative, even if you don't feel like it is. Everything you do that is new, doesn't have to be completely unique or different, but we are all walking around in our individual lives every day with this ability to create and to make things that are new. But we don't all step into that. And it's like, this is what a lot of what we experience working in the education space. Like, we don't always find the motivation to step into that fully. Right. And I feel like a lot of what you're talking about and what you had to discover as people started asking you about your process was like, oh, wow, this is important enough that others want to know. Like, it's an innate enough, exciting human quality that others want to know how I do it formally. And so, like, I'm thinking that you must have that sort of discovery as part of this, right? Is it something really, really very human that without it, there's a lot that takes away from the experience of being able to flourish.
Oh, flourishing is all what creativity is about, and being fully human in that moment, or the moments, the process. I don't know if I invented this, but I often say, I create, therefore I am. Because we see what people do, we know that what their work is. And so, yeah. And the scientists have proven it. They say we're all wired for this. Our brains are different, whether they cut up the brain or they put contacts on it and see how we think. The thing that just fascinated me is, yeah, you're right. Some people think, hey, you have to be born with this, a special thing that makes you innovative or creative or whatever. But what the scientists have said, no, the truth really is that our brains are uniquely wired to be creative.
Yes, that's an interesting distinction there, because we do place this, I think, just overall as a society, and this is not a new thing, we've always placed this this emphasis on the creative person or the creative brain as being this like specific special entity that is different. Like, there are creatives among us, but we're not all part of that. And there may be, and it's something that you're born with, and we place it on artists, but really creativity is in every field, in everything. And it's not just about profession or work. But yeah, and that is a distinction there. I think that would be really helpful if people could, I'm again thinking of schools, of course, because that's what I'm doing all day. But it would be really helpful if people could start to really understand that creativity is not for some, it's for all.
Yeah. So if you actually understand what the neuroscience tells us and what academics and artists even see in each other, is that it's an aptitude that all people have. But yet there's actually two ways, though, of parts of society that we see kind of these polar things. There are those I call the robots and the wizards. Now, they both are creative, but they both start at a different point in the creative process. And one scientist I was reading, she would talk about how then as they progress, even though they start differently, look different, as they progress, they operate like every other human being. So a scientist is going to set technique and process in place well before they begin their journey. A painter who's very technical is going to work on their technique, for instance. That's the robot. Now, the wizard is kind of the divergent thinkers, the 20% of the population that I think I fit in. They're the ones that the teachers say, "Hello, Richie, can you wake up?" That's my name as a child. They tap on my shoulder. And I'm in another world, but that's the wizard's the one who gets up in the middle of the night and has to write his ideas down right away. What they've seen is that these two are basically two networks in the brain that work. You have the default mode network, which is where the person who's the wizard is there. And so ideas are coming and there's not a lot of break on them, in other words. And then you have the other part, which is the essential executive network, which is where the convergent thinker, the 80% of people, and we focus so much on that in education. We focus so much on finding the one right answer. And the difference is idea generation on this side here with the wizard. You go from one idea and it goes everywhere. It goes to, and then what you do on the other side, convergent, is that you take and sort these ideas to find the best answer or the one right answer. And see, the thing is, you need both of these in creativity. Mm-hmm. And this is the secret. The secret, what I found out, is switching between when do I focus and become convergent, like the robot, and when is it time for me to generate ideas, like the wizard, and defocus my allow thoughts in and have an open mind. And this is it's a classic example of having two people in a room and talking to each other. If you're trying to come up with ideas and the other guy's, all he's doing is criticizing, and then she's saying, "Look at this, can you open your mind to this?" But if they both realize they have the capacity to go to the bridge, as I call it, this between science and magic, the bridge between logic and imagination, for instance. So if you're willing to travel that bridge, what they've shown is the most creative people in the world travel that bridge quickly. And so if we can learn like they learn, I think we could have a lot of aha moments.
So how do we do that?
That's a good question. And
we're going to solve it right here for you folks live today.
We're going to say, how do you do that? Well,
the creativity problem is solved today.
Part of it's, let's say one thing that a lot of common people know is the idea of curiosity. Curiosity can actually grow pathways in your brain to be open to one thing. And everybody's probably heard illustrations like this. We were on road trips as kids before we had Game Boys, right? As kids. Mm-hmm. And so we count how many orange cars could you find? And, you might find one, especially if you're going up the coast of California, there's very few cars. Eventually you're starting to see orange cars everywhere. And it's not that they just appeared, but your mind then is being trained to be curious and searching for things. And so that just represents one of the kind of things you can do to grow it. The other idea that people are somewhat familiar with is idea of flow. Mm-hmm. And that's when you get into this state where you're kind of in what they call kairos time instead of chronos time, where you're lost in this moment. And you can train yourself to get that way. What mindfulness does, by the way, is kind of help you switch between those things. And so the way this all works is, if I'm comfortable being the wizard, I'm going to not show up for appointments, or I'm going to get my paperwork late. But if I learn from the robot to get my paperwork on time, it's going to give me more freedom to be this wizard with so many new ideas, because I actually have them reservoired somewhere. So in essence, that's kind of the general gist of how I think like an educator would unlock some person's creativities by seeing, okay, they might need a little more structure or scaffolding so that their ideas can go somewhere. Because, ideas, okay, this is an idea. I don't know if I stole this or not again, but you can cite me because I might be the first person to say this. Stories are containers for dreams. Mm-hmm. And stories have like structure to them. And so you teach, my wife, I overheard her teaching English. She's an online teacher, and she's talking about, the rising action and the conclusion and things for a story. So you can look at just a structure, but you have the dream. If you have both of those things, the dream and the structure, that's how a person's creativity then can come to life.
I'm involved a lot in the writing community and the literary community in and around Los Angeles. And one of the things that I belong to a group that's called the Poetry Lab, and it's one of its founders or its only founder, I'm not sure. She said once in a workshop that always sticks with me. I think of this constantly, because she's a young woman in Los Angeles who started her own, I guess, business based on her wanting to be a poet and a writer for a living. And she said, let me start a business where we do poetry workshops throughout the area. We can do open mic nights. We can have book club, all of this stuff that goes into creating a literary life. But she said this thing once in a workshop that always sticks with me. And it was that we have this destructive idea of what it means to be a creative person, where the creative person is a little bit crazy and the creative person is messy and unstructured. And if we then extend that to being that our stereotypical idea of the creative person is some sort of an artist, then they're the person who's out of work or is always poor or can never figure out how to make money from their art. And she said that it's so destructive for us to continue to perpetuate that mindset in the modern age, because then how do I, as a 35-year-old woman in a major city that's hard to live in without money, how do I also stay sane and live a healthful life? If I want to be healthy and mindful, but also a writer, and so you talking about the bridge between those two mindsets really brought that up immediately when her name is Danielle, this woman, when she says things like that, they really resonate because I think until someone talks to you like that about the fact that you do need both to be healthy, you can kind of grow up feeling like to be some sort of creative, you also need to be a little unhealthy or off. And it still perpetuates. And I don't know if kids are growing up today thinking that, but it was something that existed forever. And we're just never going to get to a point where you can be a living, working, healthy artist and make some sort of money if you are someone who can figure out that balance or that bridge the way you're putting it. So I don't know. Does that resonate with you? The way
it absolutely,
that? Yeah,
absolutely resonates, because we have a lot of toxic traits that we try to embrace. One is the maestro at being a musician. A person's ego has to be huge. But what if they're so difficult? Everyone thinks, at least in the music world, that the maestro person, the super artist, is the real creative person. When the reality is the true creative person is a collaborator. So they have to get along with people. They have to have emotional intelligence. They have to learn to negotiate. You have to learn to give and take to see things happen. They have to expand their vision and go through the pain of saying, I'm got to be humble enough to trust this person. If you think about it, the collaborator exists on the bridge, right? Oh, yes. Don't they have to go back and forth? Well, I'm into the metaphor here. And the other metaphor I use for like creative process, I call it the dream, the sandbox, and the story. And the sandbox, the dream is, of course, where your ideation, you get the ideas. That's where the brain is the wizard. And you come to this idea of the sandbox where you kind of switch between these two, of the robot and wizard, and you work within constraints. And so you learn what your budget is, you learn how much time you have, you learn what your canvas is, and you develop your idea. In tech world, they call that the sandbox for checking out software. So that's there. And then, of course, the story is how do we bring it out into the real world? And that's where we have to detail everything. I get it ready to be, like my book is to cover professional enough. And, I like have 10 people, you have 6 drafts of a book. People don't know this, and pain of editors going back and forth and all that stuff that happens as you finish your project. So anyway, but what we're talking about here is the idea of constraints, and it's not healthy as a human being to live without constraints, because time and space, physics, miracles happen in time and space. So if we're not in time and space, we're missing the miracle of just breathing in this moment. I was like going through I have some of the quotes. I'm guessing are they from your book, the quotes that are on your blog? Some of them might be. But I had some of those open before, and there's so many things that are similar between the quotes themselves, but you talk a lot. And also reminding me of this bridge metaphor, because I'm guessing that's all on purpose. Of course it is. Must mean you really believe this stuff. I love the bridge. We need bridges today. We have so many things like walls, Well, you mentioned a lot of things. You have a lot of things about nuance. That's one of your recent ones, right? Nuance, and a lot of things about being in the middle and having to think about
not just where you belong, but being in the middle and having to piece things together. And that is kind of, I think, the essence of what you're talking about.
Yeah, the bridge is just, it really is a way of thinking that allows me for nuance. And I think one of the quote you might have said is that certainty is my enemy and nuance is my friend.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm just only looking for certainty and I'm not willing to see gray and explore that, I'm going to miss out on the bigger picture for myself. And, our society, I think this is really important. We need to learn to bridge between what is an imaginative thought and what is critical thinking. And so both of these things are together. In fact, this is something that blew my mind. One researcher, she says that imagination is logical. And I had to turn the page back and say, what did she just say? And she explained it this way. You walk towards a cliff and your body has all these things and it's too quick for your brain to come up with a list of here's the 10 things that could happen. But you're feeling like, okay, the wind might blow me off and, some, prank might happen and I'm on the other side of off the cliff. So what you're feeling is coming from the central executive of your brain telling you there's
mm-hmm.
dangers, but you're doing it in pictures and quickly in your brain to kind of protect yourself. So it's actually logical for you to have these reactions. And if we understand that, then we can kind of decode even what is healthy for us, what's not healthy for us, and listen to what our body tells us sometimes more than a lot of us in my generation that, say I'm over 50,
mm-hmm.
We were kind of told, no, don't trust those feelings yet. You just got to be critical and logical, especially if you're in technical fields, of course, my friends. But
mm-hmm.
all that to say is it's logical to be imaginative. And so if I'm not willing to go there and see possibilities, then maybe I'm not really grounded.
I had never thought of it in that exact wording, logical to be imaginative, but it is reminding me of some of the research and reading that I've done extensively over the last couple of years about focus and flow, like you were mentioning before, but specifically about the many different kinds of focus that we have and that most of us are not tapping into all of them, and we're not really aware how to even utilize our own attentional skills. We think that we've lost the ability to pay attention, but there is a part of focus studies that talks about, it's almost like one of the most high levels of focus where you're not just, we think of focus as being really narrow on one thing or a few things and being able to switch between a few things. But if you widen that scope, they think of it in terms of what the most busy, powerful leaders have to do, where they have to be able to widen their scope and focus on many things at once, many people, many groups of people, many individuals within those groups, many ideas that are being formed within those groups, ideas that are coming new from their own brain. And in order to do, you're now talking about another metaphor for another kind of bridge, right? They have to think widely, about all of, it's almost like taking a floodlight, and they have to see, rather than it being a flashlight, it's like a floodlight of all of these people and ideas and teams and functions, plus future possibilities and problem solving. And that's just one part of it. That's part of what I was thinking, imagination being something that you have to have as part of that focus. But then also part of the focus studies is being able to know when you also need to just take a break from intensity and let your imagination wander, because that is where creativity, that's that other nuance, right? When you take, if I'm here at this desk for 4 hours and I'm doing video interview after video or whatever it is that I'm on a screen, and then and I'm hitting a block, then I try to write a blog after being 4 hours on video, and I can't. It's because I need to let my brain kind of dissipate a bit and get up and let the imagination kind of wander. And then I can come back and maybe suddenly the focus takes hold again. And I think we kind of we've gotten discouraged from this idea of mind wandering. And really that's something that brings us back to finding creativity, I believe.
Well, you mentioned two main things here that are really excited me over time as I've been researching the creativity. the first thing is about like leaders and how the good ones can see broadly. They call that multi-framing. So what they're able to do is it's like multiverse, Marvel, we love Marvel. and you choose to say, I'm thinking of HR as a window, and I'm being empathetic institutionally about that. Then I'm thinking of the politics involved. I'm thinking then of another frame of the structure of the business. I'm thinking of the 4 frames here, the Bowman deal. The fourth one is symbolism. What's our values? And so a leader will have the ability to quickly switch. That's again, his bridge between many different things in front of them. Also, it's like one leader said in a book I read, that you're on the balcony and dance floor. You have to be able to switch between seeing perspective and then being in the moment. And so the mind wandering part, though, that you mentioned is really exciting because you have to play sometimes. And there are 4 points that for 100 years, academics around the world have reinforced from a guy named Graham Wallace way back in the day. And apparently he wasn't the greatest guy in the whole world, but he came up with this idea of these 4 steps in creativity, where I kind of stole that from my 3-step process, the dream, sandbox, and story. And basically you have this idea of preparation, where you get ready for everything. Then you have this idea of incubation, where you go under, and that's where you're talking about you got to withdraw, whatever. And then there's illumination, where the ideas actually then start coming. And then there's, of course, elaboration. And you go iteratively through this process again, and maybe recursively too. So this is where rest is so important. This is where your mind is always going to be working, in other words, but you can choose to find, something peaceful, or walking, by the way, is a big deal. I do that one.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, sometimes that's how people really get into that mind wandering state, right? You just have to let your body wander. You let your body wander, and the mind will go with it, maybe.
And we're stuck behind screens. Like if I'm writing or making music, I'm behind a screen all the time. We're behind screens right now. And so for us to get up and just notice, hey, that's a pretty cool, the plant's blooming finally.
Yeah. And to think about how educators can apply, I have a feeling that when people do listen to this episode, even though creativity is on our minds as educators all the time, but in the terms of like, how do I inspire or create spaces within a structured school environment that allow for more creativity. And a lot of that has come in recent years in things like a project-based learning environment, where it's a little bit less structured and more hands-on. Like there are a lot of different environments like that are embraced in schools, in formal school settings these days. But I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking about how that can even be pushed further, because I love this idea of embracing both the structure and the I don't know, not the imagination or whatever.
The magic and the science is how I feel.
Yes.
That is to me the question about creativity. And I don't necessarily have all the answers, but
Give us the answers.
But I think it's identifying, first of all, 20% are going to be your divergent thinkers. So out of your classroom, you're going to have, 2 out of 10 who are not going to be as convergent. But they may be actually more adept at being able to come up with ideas and concepts at a higher level. And so the idea is, how do you take a dominant culture in an educational environment that teaches to get one right answer, and then begin to say, what kind of answers are going to take more imagination? And so how can you structure things so that both of those, you challenge both sides? So you say how do we take your imaginative thought and lead it to some conclusion? But how do you take your conclusion backwards and look behind your shoulder and see, what other opportunities could you have thought of? What other things could you have solved? What other ways can you solve this math problem that you found one way that works for you all the time, but maybe it's, and that's an exercise of the brain. So in doing so, you're going to teach, I think, critical thinking. You're going to teach people to be more, quote, what I call that nuance area, which requires whatever's more comfortable to you. It's bringing that student or that employee or whatever, yourself, to the other side to see it's awkward for me. I always call this embracing the awkward. So for me, it was embracing time management. I got to embrace time management, whatever, because I'm living on Kairos time all the time. And so I have to realize, okay, here's the clock. So I think that's kind of the key. I think that's the really key is how do you structure things so that you bring the bridge to both directions and knowing which people in the room need help going to where, and not doing them at the same time is the other thing that researchers kind of seem to say it all together, is you can't really do both of these ways of thinking in your own brain at the same time. Two people doing them are going to have conflicts, but if you're in your brain, you're going to be kind of like, it's the gas and it's the brake at the same time. And so that's where learning about the creative process is very important, because it's a human process. And if humans are wired this way, then I think we can learn better this way too.
And so that actually leads perfectly into what my last couple of questions were going to be, is that your, I guess, audience for these kinds of discussions and for things like your book is really everybody. It's not like this is a book for people looking to be more creative, or I want to talk to people who are, artists. You're thinking about this as a human action.
To thrive and flourish as a human being is to find out more of how we are made as a human being, or designed, and giving space for that to happen. And so that's my focus, and that's the desire. That's why I really think it's another way just to describe what we are when we are thriving or flourishing is what creativity. That's why war and these terrible things happening around us are tragic, because the loss of life is the loss of a human being. And what do they do? We're losing their creation. We're blowing up things as opposed to building things. And so the more we can build, the more we can get beyond a zero-sum thinking about ourselves and realize that the generosity for myself, to let myself create, is what's going to be generosity to my community and to those around me.
When I was a senior in high school, I was the first class to take this because they had just offered a new elective for seniors that was a half-year course. And it was like kind of half an art course, but almost then like a philosophy course as well. It was taught by a theater teacher, but it was like all of these things combined. But so we were the first group to take this class. And I can't remember it had a long title, the name of the course, but it was essentially literally what we're talking about. The basis was like creativity is like human beings are creative acts, or something like it was about being creative as a human. But the idea was it was specifically being offered to high school to seniors, because you're about to go off into the adult world, whether you're going to college or wherever. And where you're going to be pulled into a space where people are telling you not to play, and you have to start to be serious. Now you have to think about your real life. What are you going to do? And then all of the things that you've kind of not been asked to do, or suddenly, for 18 years are now going to be thrown at you in various degrees, not all at once for everybody. But at the same time, regardless of what your actual individual responsibilities become, you are increasingly being told at that point that to be an adult looks one way, but to be a child looks another way. And now you're going to move from one to the other, and you can't do the things that you loved when you were a kid. And the idea of this class was, let's not think of it as doing things that we did when we were a kid, but let's think of all of the things that you do as being creative acts. And so everybody in this class is going to paint whatever. Everybody in this class is going to record themselves playing or singing or what. So it didn't matter. I mean, if you were an athlete or an artist or an engineer or anything, you were going to do every single creative project. You didn't pick one based on your interests. Everybody did all of them. And so we would come in one day after the 2 weeks where we painted. And when those projects were done, we would have to put them on the floor in a circle and walk around and do like a gallery walk and pretend we were in a museum and literally like write comments to people, reflections about, I love how you used the color red here. Like things like that. And we did the same thing for recording. We did it for everything, sculpture, writing, stuff like that. And then it wound up being, and I haven't been back. I used to visit that classroom occasionally. I haven't been back there in years, in like 6 years probably. But at that point, even 6 years ago, if you walked into what used to be that teacher's classroom, the paintings from my class are still hanging up on campuses.
Wow.
From 20 years ago, as if it's a museum, because we were the first class that did it. But everything that you created became part of the museum of that room, as if like we are all able to be a part of this, and this is what makes us human, and not to let that go just because you've turned 18 and you're leaving high school. Like you're allowed to go out with your friends and run in a field and scream like kids. Like that's part of creativity. That's the imagination. And so what you're working on and what you're trying to get people to think about and take a little bit more seriously is it reminding me of that experience of, and it was something that I took that course because I felt that impending doom of like, oh no, adulthood, like, how do I embrace this? But I did know a lot of parents, like adults at that time were also against that of like, this is ridiculous. This is a waste of time. Like you're going to college. And so there's a bridge right there, right? How do we bridge both of those things? We don't want to say, I'm staying 15 forever. We're not like in Peter Pan world, but at the same time, it's so much healthier if years and years go by and you can still slip into that space. So yeah, I just built another bridge for us there, but it's reminding me, all of this wraps into what you're saying, I think.
I love that, and to be able to see 20 years later that memory and to know why it was done too. Because there's a lot of voices that want us to fit in boxes, but really our job is to see, what can we create? If we're stuck in a box, well, we still got to learn to play. And I think that's been proven in LA, where I don't live there anymore. I live in San Francisco Bay Area, but I loved my musician friends. They work so hard. If you're getting in a van and you're traveling, you're not a big act, you're going to be playing little shows, and all you go through to slog to get to that moment of creation. But how they kept going too is they played. A couple of my friends were great cooks, and my goodness, they enjoyed food, and they had things in their life that they created that was beyond even their work as musicians. And so I think this is, you see creative people around you and say, why does that person keep going and thriving? You'll see their work, but you also see, I think, their play.
Well, what a great note to end that conversation on. That was perfect. It's almost like we pre-wrote that script there, but no, that was a creative act in itself. So I'm wondering if maybe you can give us some insight into a little bit of a fuller picture of what kind of things you consume or have loved to consume recently. Is there anything you've been reading or watching or listening to that you would like to recommend to people? You can say, no, I've consumed nothing.
Well, I've consumed food.
Sure. Okay, food.
Lots of food.
We recommend eating.
Sushi is always a good thing if you can get a fun sushi place. I am reading this interesting. This Palgrave Studies is like this academic group in Europe mostly. And there's a new book they have on, it's a newer book to me, on sociology of creativity. So I'm reading this and it's blowing my mind because there's so much they're studying right now about not just how an individual creates, but the implications for society. And so my curiosity is going in that direction. And I'm reading a sci-fi novel that I forgot what the title is, but it's really cool. There's like these spiders, giant spiders that they're trying to fight from this village. So I'm like thinking about that in the back of my head. I can't remember the title of it, but we
won't put that in the show notes until I know the title.
Well, it's like 100 pages in, and it's like a 600-page novel my daughter gave me because I'm not normally a person who'd read fantasy, but it's again, okay, I need to read this because I'm getting into it. But again, my brain is, how can I understand fantasy literature if I'd never read it? So
yeah. Cool. And so where can people find you and connect with you? And if they want to talk to you more about this stuff or just interact with you on the web somewhere?
Well, you can go to my site. It's rkblog.com. And also find me on Twitter. Not there as much as I used to be. Threads. I love Threads, by the way, if people are.
Do you? Are you threading a lot?
I am threading.
I feel like we've all abandoned it. We were threading like a couple months ago, and I feel like
I'm a stalker on Thread because I have just a circle of folks that I can see on there now. Where when I was on Twitter and
it used to be hidden.
It's just hard to see. But yeah, so rkblog.com, and my book is on Amazon somewhere, and audio and all the different formats. So. Cool. That's fun.
All right. Well, we'll put all the notes, all the links to those things in the show notes so people can find you and talk to you and ask you questions and say, no, I disagree with you.
I love that because you know what?
Let's have open Twitter arguments about creativity, everybody.
I'm still on the bridge. So maybe if I made some mistakes here, I'd love to know.
The bridge has to be in the title of this episode somewhere, or the art or the artwork for this episode somewhere. But otherwise, is there anything else you want to leave people with? Because I think that's it.
You are creative, so keep creating.
There is nothing I like more than an unexpected opportunity to connect with someone new. Someone who's doing the real work to help people find their potential. Rich is an example of this. I hope our conversation here helped you to reflect a bit more deeply on your ideas about what creativity is and how you take advantage or don't take advantage of this bridge that is waiting for us to discover it. Once again, our habits are going to form us here. How can we boost our tolerance for failure and increase our willingness to iterate and discover over and over? This is the key to thriving in a future with AI, unlocking meta-creativity as an even higher order thinking skill. You can let us know exactly what you think of this episode by leaving a comment on Substack if you're a subscriber, a review in Apple Podcasts, and you can reach me on Twitter at scandela9. The hashtag Optimalist can be used when posting answers to questions that we ask here, and that way I'll be sure to see it. I can also be reached at Sarah, with no H, at getengageable.com. You can listen and subscribe to the Optimalist podcast wherever you love listening to great podcasts. New episodes are released every Wednesday, and links to all of the resources that we talk about are available in the show notes. The Optimalist podcast is brought to you by Engageable, the only app that gives you the mindful pulse you need for doing better. And it's free. Create an account today at getengageable.com or by downloading Engageable on any iOS or Android device. You can also follow us at GetEngageable on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening to The Optimalist, and I'll be back next week with a new conversation. Stay engaged.